Hello. Welcome back to the David Watson podcast. Today I spoke with Martin, the author of Children of the Dying Hearth, fantasy novel that's going to be part of a six-book series, double trilogy. Has some amazing epic characters. And one of the things Martin and I got into very heavily, which I really enjoyed, was the build up and the journey of the characters and how it can reflect real life, which is what all good writing does. And I really hope you enjoy it. Thank you. Hello, welcome to the David Watson podcast. Thank you very much for joining me. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm very well. I'm very well. And as I said just briefly before we started, I am looking forward to this because I've discovered a word of something that I've no idea what it is. But before we get into my curiosity, uh, explain to people the book.
Yeah. Martin R. Nelson, for those who didn't maybe read the title of the podcast and just clicked and started listening right away, the title of the book is Children of the Dying Hearth. And it's a high fantasy, multi perspective novel. It's the first in the series, set to be six books. And as all those qualifiers essentially boil down to, there's a lot to build up in this book. So going into each character in detail may take more time than we have. But at the core of it is this idea that regardless of who you are, of what stage of life you're in, whether you're a young teenage boy setting out in the world and want to be a pirate, that's one of the main characters, a middle-aged uh, ruler, that's another one,
Yeah.
or a over 500-year-old elf. At the core of every one of these characters is a struggle to maintain or perhaps desire to be near where you're comfortable. It's this childlike aspect that you want to be where you feel at home, you want to be
Yeah.
where it's safe, and ultimately, they won't ever grow if they stay there. And it's the imagery of a child at a dying hearth, a dying fire, that it's what they know, it's what they're comfortable with, but at the end of the day, they need to go out into the cold, cold world and experience what's out there and push themselves. And for each of these characters, that's different. For one character, it may be the opposite of another. Um, but at the end of the day, it's about them getting out where they're uncomfortable, where it's uh, totally out of their comfort zone, and in order for them to really grow into the person that they want to be or that they need to be, more importantly for the story, I guess, they need to get out there. So that's in a nutshell. That's kind of what the book is about. That internal struggle between some very different characters.
One of the things I was going to ask you about this, because and I've
Mhm.
made a little note on my sheet of paper, and it's big. So the press release that was sent to me, one of the things that come through, and sorry if you can hear paper rattling about, it's my notes.
Oh,
It
you're
says
good.
one of your book's messages seems to be about the human desire to stay where you are comfortable, but you
Hmm.
believe there should be a need to get out of that comfort zone in order to really grow as individuals. And
Hmm.
then the next bit is tell us about that. But the thing I wanted to know about is, and I've got to try and articulate this so it doesn't sound clumsy. So if it comes across as clumsy, I do apologize. But it's like sometimes when we write books or write, we're telling a story through characters, but we're really
Hmm.
hoping you're going to listen to the lesson so that it won't, so that it'll impact you and you'll do something about your own life. So why do
Hmm.
you care about that?
Um, Part of the reason I care is because I'm a teacher.
Yeah.
And I see this every day with my students that, especially in the last couple of years, which has been a little depressing, if I'm being honest,
Yeah.
of the idea of students especially, but I see it with adults too, of they have a dream or a vision or a goal, and they end up just wasting their time on the couch. And I mean, don't get me wrong, watching Netflix or playing video games on the couch, it can be inspiring.
It's good. Yeah,
But at
it
the
can
end
be
of the
good.
day, I mean, at the end of the day, you have to, for me, put pen to paper and write the book. Um, for someone else, it could be, I want to lose some weight, I want to get in shape, whatever it is. Well, at some point, you need to stop watching YouTube videos about what exercises to do and actually go and do it. Um, and so I think part of that comes from me just being a teacher and just observing not just my own students, but also other adults just kind of complain about their lives. And it's a mindset of, well, what are you going to do about it? Um, which I think there's a growing movement in the world now of that.
Mm.
It's growing popularity of different figures. David Goggins is one that
Oh,
it's like, all
massive,
right,
yeah,
well,
huge,
get off your
huge,
butt, go do something, quit
yeah,
complaining. I'm not as brutal as David Goggins, especially not towards the reader. Towards some of the characters, it might have some brutality,
yeah,
um, but it's. I really do hope, and this is also the reason why I classify this book as new adult rather than young
yeah.
adult.
I've seen that.
Um,
Yeah,
It's because the new adult is more geared towards that late teen, 16, 17, 18 at the earliest stages of life, because I really do want the reader to get that nuance. I would love if it's just escapism. If they get that from there, that it's, I went on an adventure, I read about some romance and some political intrigue, that was interesting. But I don't want them to put the book down necessarily and be like, all right, blank slate, let's move on to the next thing. It would be, I would feel very honored if readers read it and they really started thinking about themselves and kind of said, like, maybe I should step out from under my parents'
yeah,
um, auspices, so to speak. Faye, one of the characters, is a late teen, half elf, half human, and that's very much her kind of struggle, and her hearth is her mom basically rules her life, and she wants independence. And I think anyone, um, I think everyone at some point in their life goes through that sort of stage with their parents of like, let me be an adult.
yeah.
Um, and I think on the parent side, it's equally difficult to look at your kid and say, you are an adult, and I'm going to let you fail, succeed, whatever it is. But it's I have no control over your life anymore. Um,
I
like
think
both
that's
sides are very different.
yeah, because it is very hard, isn't it? When you're a parent and also when you observe your parents, because as a parent, you desperately don't want your children to. And I don't have kids, I have my own, but I see it around me and stuff where people that they're desperate for their children not to fail, not because they don't see the lesson in failing, they don't want them to feel the pain that they felt or the
Mm-hmm.
perceived pain that they think they remember. So it comes from a
Yeah.
really good place. But children haven't experienced that yet, so they don't understand why the parent is trying to do something good for them. They don't see it as that, they see
Mm-hmm.
it as interference. And then
Yeah.
the other thing, I noticed this in myself, and I had to observe this, especially towards, like my father, where there was a point in my life, not that many years ago, I was in like my 40s, my mid 40s, and I realized that all of these things that I thought were my dad's faults were like, oh no, he was just struggling with his own thing, but he happened to have three kids. It turns out
Yeah.
that's what
Uh,
life is.
there's a couple people in the field of psychology who have talked about that. It's like you really become an adult when you experience the death of your parents, and that's
Yeah,
can be a figurative death where it's like, oh, you're a human, like
yeah,
you screw up just as much as me. This is weird, and then you realize their fallibility, and it opens up this whole kind of realm of like the. I think some people in that field there's kind of a god complex that the kids bestow upon the parents that you can't mess up. And then when they recognize that, it becomes a
yeah. I mean,
world shattering moment.
yeah, well, mine came because me and my dad have never been close, and when we don't speak. And I was I think I was in a bit of an angry place, if you like. And then I suddenly realised I was having my own problems, and I was just like, Christ, I'm having my own problems, and I'm twice his age when he had me, and I'm still having problems. So
Hmm.
maybe. his life was quite difficult, and I've just never really understood that.
Yeah. It's, I mean, really internalizing that experience of the
Yeah,
other. I mean, it's the true essence of empathy then. And
it was a real
um,
eye opener because I was having a real difficult time
yeah.
in my life, and for some reason I thought about my dad, and suddenly thought, well, actually, maybe he didn't have the resources to deal with the things that were
Hmm.
going on in his life, and maybe he's not such
Yeah.
a bad person. We just don't connect, and that's it's just that simple and not that personal.
Yeah. Yeah. Recognizing their own humanity, I think, is a big stepping stone for any
Mm.
child. Which again, the child can be 40 years old. I'm not saying there's any
Yeah,
sort of infantilism or like you're a kid who hasn't grown up, but there's a real um, and that's again what the book is referring to with the children aspect is we're all children in some way.
yeah,
We're all new to stuff. I think it's funny. So I recently started this last year jujitsu,
yeah,
and as a 35-year-old, 34-year-old, I'll be 35 in a month. Um, Being totally new at something where some 16-year-old is just kicking your butt is a very humbling experience.
yeah,
But at the same time, I was just rolling with a guy last night at jujitsu, and it was the first time he'd ever done something, and now I've done it for about a year, so I got a little bit more comfortable with it, and he was just struggling with it. And I asked him like, "Well, how many times have you done it?" And he goes, "Well, this is like the fifth time we've gone through it, so five." Like, well,
yeah,
why
yeah,
do you expect to be good? Like, we're all children in some aspect of whatever we're new at, and so that's really kind of the underlying basis of there's parts within the book where the title is actually somewhat referenced in relation to uh, other things, but the main takeaway from that title is that each of the characters really are children, just as everyone is, and
yeah.
it's accepting that and realizing I need to grow up. I need to push forward into this uncomfortable zone, and whatever happens, happens. But it's that push forward is what will help me ultimately, even if it might hurt at first.
Do you
That's what needs to be done.
do you find that because there's a lot of depth to the characters in the
Hmm.
book, and the and it comes from is fantasy the right word? The right word? Is it?
For the genre, yeah,
Yeah. Um,
yeah,
do you find that because they're characters, do you find it much easier to explore things you wouldn't want to talk about from your own point of view, as if you were talking about yourself? So, I'll put it in this person, and then I'll
yeah,
completely just
yeah,
go to town on it and say, no, it's nothing to do with me.
yeah,
It's just popped in my head.
yeah, 1,000%. That's it's one of those things of I mean, there's so many novels out right now that are they're fiction,
Yeah,
but they're telling the story from a black writer or a Latino or Latina writer or some different ethnicity about the struggle of growing up in some city or some town as a minority, right? As a straight white male writing about the struggles of a Puerto Rican immigrant in a heavy Cuban population part of Miami, I'm sure a lot of readers will go, "What the hell experience do you have in this?"
yeah, yeah,
um, and I think the joy of writing fantasy, especially with these fantasy races like elves and dwarves, etc., is you can kind of boil that identity down to the human element rather than keep it as the Puerto Rican immigrant or the Cuban immigrant or the um, the Chinese immigrant in LA who goes to a school district where he's the only Chinese kid, right? Um, those are all fascinating stories, but the joy I think of fantasy is you can boil that experience down to a character that then every single minority can actually relate to,
mm,
which is so Faye, for instance, is my example of she's half elf, half human, and she gets targeted for that. She gets called derogatory names for it. There's She has her own ambitions, and she's very, very worried about, will this be allowed because I'm this kind of mixed race individual? And I mean, that is in a way the core struggle of a lot of these fiction books coming out of different authors talking about, like I said, the Puerto Rican immigrant, the Cuban immigrant, etc. So it's really enjoyable with fantasy because I can just kind of ignore the surface level race or
Yeah.
ethnicity and say, let's actually deal with the human side of it. And it's, you feel isolated, you feel alone, you don't feel like anyone really understands you or sees you for what you can do and who you are as a person. They see you as just the image that they've cast upon you, which, again, straight white male. I'm sure there's many people who would say, "What experience do I have with
Yeah.
this?"
Yeah.
And oddly enough, I do have some
Oh, well,
from
because
my
I mean, you've travelled all over Europe doing various
yeah,
things, so you can't tell me you never run into problems. So I live in England,
yeah,
and
yeah,
and
yeah.
my mum's an Irish immigrant, right in the height of the
Hmm.
Troubles, who married a British soldier.
Oh yeah,
Do you know what I mean?
yeah,
So people say, "Oh, you don't know
yeah,
about racism." Really, you should have tried being
yeah,
from an Irish family in England
yeah,
when the IRA were blowing up the UK, when your dad's in
yeah. I'm
the
sure you
army.
got it from both sides too.
Yeah, yeah,
The Irish
absolutely.
saying, "What is she doing marrying a
Oh
Brit?"
yeah,
And
yeah,
then
yeah. And when
there's
we used to
yeah,
go home to Ireland, don't tell anyone what your dad does.
yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah. With me, it was an odd bit with soccer actually because I was trying out for various teams. I used to play semi-professional
Mm,
soccer in Europe. I traveled all around, visited Romania and Spain and Portugal with different teams. I ended up Spain was a lot of fun because I got trained with Valencia and their coaches.
nice.
Uh, Fantastic training grounds, which is totally eye-opening as an American
Yeah.
from small town Oregon, right?
Nice part of Spain as well, Valencia.
Yeah, oh yeah, yeah. We were there during a music festival too, which was
Oh, brilliant.
again 19. It's a music festival. I'm like, I'm supposed to be here for soccer, but
You were living a
hello.
dream.
Yeah, yeah. I don't really want this to succeed. Ended up in Germany and was playing in lower divisions, and I got the blunt reply one time when me and a couple other guys were trying out for a team, and one of them got a call back, which some of the other guys were like, that seems weird, um, because him and I were playing in the same position, and he was well, why did he get picked? It's like, I don't know, I wasn't good enough, and that's my kind of mindset towards it. And one of the Germans actually said, no, it's because he's black. And I was like, huh, like what do you mean? And he said the coaches feel that he has therefore more potential to grow. Like, oh, all right. And I mean, I could have very easily just said, like, there's discrimination. I'm done. I want to talk to the coaches, throw a huge fit. And instead, I basically said, I need to be that much better. I need to make sure there's no room for any sort of, well, what aspect do they have that's not quite so um, nuanced or surface level, whatever you want to call it. And I upped my training regimen after that. Unfortunately, some stuff happened back home, which meant that I had to kind of end that dream of playing soccer. Um, but it really having that mental shift. One, the idea of being discriminated against because of race was a
Yeah.
as a white person, it's you don't see necessarily the blunt value of it, especially in America, um, or the blunt kind of not
Well, I
value,
think one
blunt.
of the problems that people have in America, and it's difficult to say this without sounding disrespectful, they're quite insular and don't really understand that the rest of the world has quite a lot of prejudice in it for lots of different reasons. And that if you go
Yeah,
to Europe, which is predominantly white, you'll be amazed how many white people hate other white people. And have a
yeah,
thousand and one reasons why they don't like the white people from
yeah,
that country. And this idea that white people only hate people who aren't white, no. And the same as if anyone knows anybody from the continent of Africa, they'll be surprised how many Africans hate each other from different countries.
yeah,
And if you go to
yeah.
Eastern Europe, former Yugoslavia countries, they fiercely hate each other, and they're all white.
Hmm.
And it's like, why do you hate
Yeah.
that person? Because we were at a civil war with them 20 years ago or 30
Yeah.
years ago. And if you go to certain parts of
Yeah.
Spain, someone independence and they hate each other, you know. And
Yeah.
well, you'd know from Germany. Germany can be, I've got friends who live in Munich, the Bavarian area, and they might not be so
Yeah.
fond of other parts of Germany. And there's a lot of
Yeah.
rivalry.
Yeah, I actually have a funny story about that from my time in grad school. I went to Fordham University for my master's in history in New York, and I was at a gathering, we shall say, of other grad students, and one of them was a speech pathologist, and she was making the case that standardized tests in English are racist because English is a language geared towards white people, and um, she also made a case about she made this claim that white people don't have to struggle with teachers mispronouncing like kids' names. And I looked at her, I was like, "You've never met anyone from Poland, have you?"
Yeah,
Like,
exactly. Yeah,
like good luck pronouncing a Polish name if you don't speak Polish.
or Greek.
Um, or Greek or Yugoslavian or a
Yeah,
lot of the Eastern
yeah,
countries have. I mean, I was in Romania for a bit, and it took me a little time to get some of
yeah, yeah,
the phonetic differences with just the
yeah,
basic
yeah.
still
Because
English alphabet.
well, because they have a different alphabet, don't they? The Greeks
Uh,
have their own alphabet. The former
Greece, Romania.
the former USSR countries have their own alphabet. It's
Uh,
we're
for the
phonetic, I
most,
think. They have, I
for
think,
the most,
31 letters. We have 26.
um, so when I was in Romania, they used the
Okay, yeah,
alphabet. Yeah, there
yeah,
wasn't much different other than the C with a little squiggly bit on
yeah,
it.
yeah,
I mean, it's the same as like German with the umlauts over the U
yeah,
or the O. Like, there's little differences, but it's not a totally different thing. Um, but Polish has that like L with this cross through it that every time I see that, I have to look up how to pronounce it.
yeah.
So it's
And it is
there's
it's
like
these misconceptions that people have,
yeah,
you know.
yeah,
And it's funny because there's something you talk about that in the book about the prejudice that you have in the world of fantasy. And it was
mm,
only I thought about that when I was going through the notes, and I was just like, do you know what? And it's going to sound really dumb, right? But I suddenly like realized and joined all the dots because every sci-fi, every fantasy I've ever read, I suddenly realized how much racism is in them. It's, do you know what I mean? It's like elves will hate dwarfs, dwarfs will hate,
yeah,
do you know what I mean? But I've never joined the dots and saw the connection between, oh yeah, this is mirroring human life, isn't it? Oh yeah, right. Oh, well done,
yeah.
David. You're 49. You've just figured that out today. Well done.
It's, yeah, it's. I mean, going back to Tolkien, he's the oldest example, right?
Mm,
Of the dwarves hate the elves and everything. There's a little less of that in mine. There's some distrust between the different races. So it's less overt than other fantasies will be. But it is. I mean, it reflects human nature
yeah, of
of
course.
like our side is the best. We have the best stuff, and your side, which is different than ours. How do we see that you? Why do you even like that? We don't get it. And then their side says, "Well, we have our thing. It's the best, and we don't get your thing." Um, and I've tried to temper that a little bit more towards the kind of distrust side rather than the open animosity of elves don't like dwarves. So, for instance, one of the two of the leaders, they're called pentarchs in the book. The five leaders of the Crux, which is the city at the center of the world that joins all four continents. Um, one's an elf and one's a dwarf, and uh, because the dwarf Thena is she's actually away for this whole book. She makes an appearance. She is one of the narrators actually in the second book, which I'm currently editing and working through. Uh, there's no real animosity between them. It's very much a I want to do what's best for my people, but I don't like hate you or anything. It's I'm gonna do what's best for my side. You do what's best for yours. We'll meet at some compromise, and that's kind of it. Which uh, I don't think is a bad way to kind of live life if you want to preserve separate cultures. You have to have some uh, some survival instinct towards your culture if you want to preserve it. Like I want to do what's best for we were just talking about Romanian, Yugoslavian,
Yeah,
right? If Romanian culture wants to stay Romanian, they need to have some sort of push towards keeping it around and not having it
it's simple
disappear.
self-preservation.
Yeah, yeah.
If
You
I
need
want to live the life my grandparents lived, it's
yeah,
self-preservation, and
yeah,
that's it's not always. I mean, look, we live in a troubled world right now. I mean,
mhm,
look, politically, lots of people are upset, and and again, and it's difficult to cover it because it's very complex. But when I look at it generally, and when I say it comes from a place of fear, I'm not trying to belittle it because I suffer from the same problem. But mostly it's because I'm being told I have to respect a person entering my country, but they don't have to. I don't feel they have to respect me. Now, how right or
yeah,
wrong that is open for debate. I'm just being honest about how it makes me feel. Do you know what I mean?
yeah,
And that's where, like
yeah,
I said, as somebody who I have dual nationality, I'm both I hold British passport and an Irish passport, and and my dad is British, my mum is English, Irish, sorry, and so I'm aware of two countries that are at each other's throat.
mhm,
And still a lot of animosity between them in certain parts of the countries, but I can't split who I am to take a side if I wanted
mhm,
to, and that's where things become complicated for every person in every genre, in
yeah,
every book, in every nationality, fiction and reality
mhm,
is, like you
yeah.
said, one of your characters is half elf, half, I forgot, was she was half elf,
Human. Yeah,
half human. Yeah. It's just like, right, well, what do you want me to do? Split myself in the middle? And who gets to have
right.
which part?
Yeah, and that's. I mean, in terms of the real world consequence, though, I don't think there needs to be an issue with it. This is one of the things that I've actually got into with my students a bit. So I teach history and Latin at the high school level, and um, one of my classes is an ethics class because what it started out as actually a history of torture,
Yeah.
but it was a neat vehicle to actually explore the history of ethics throughout the world. And I think the one of the things that we get to is the concept of the kind of American dream, where it doesn't matter who you are or where you come from, you can kind of make it here, right? You can fulfill whatever part of your identity that you want to build up and be who you want to be. And that's a very multicultural, accepting ideal. And I think it's great, but it needs to have the underlying kind of rule that which is almost more of a libertarian side of things of you do your thing and I'll do my thing and we don't interfere with each other.
Yeah.
And I think that with with a place that has a fairly well-known history like England, right? I mean, going through grad school for medieval history, it seemed like 9 out of 10 of the medievalists were British historians. um, there is a rich history there. I mean,
Yeah.
there's also rich history in America that is native focused. And I don't see why Native American culture can't coexist next to kind of more modern Western American culture of New York City with tribal leaders, tribal councils, etc., on their traditional lands. Um, it, but it needs to come from a place of kind of live and let live, which to me was the core of that American dream of like you do your thing and I'll do mine as long as we're not harming anyone. Like let's just
Well, I think that's probably
do our thing.
where the problem with, I think is the problem or the most obstructive part of the rise of the internet is
Mm,
pre-internet, we were much more community based and community focused, and
hmm
national issues and global issues were not something you could get a feed on 24/7 or have an opinion on that you could share.
Yeah,
Like, we couldn't do this. You and I would not know
yeah,
the other guy existed. And
yeah,
the bonus of where we are today is you and I can have a conversation. The downside of where we are today is you and I can hate from the other side of the world about a country we don't even live in and
Yeah.
have an opinion about it. And I don't think we're old enough as a community globally to understand how to handle that. I think I don't even think we've got out of the
Mhm.
diapers and the nappies yet. We're still breastfeeding. We really don't know
Yeah.
how to navigate it and what that
Yeah.
navigation should mean or look like, because we haven't even
Yeah.
taken first steps in it. And if I could go back just 24 years back to 2000, and I was living in a house, I didn't really know anything about America other than what was on MTV, and
Hmm.
I thought everything was pretty cool about that. And I think one of the things changed, that's changed dramatically, is people are trying to dissect history as if history did something wrong, instead of, no, history is just a
Mm.
recording of history is recording the reality at that time. And no
Hmm.
matter what your opinion about it is 200 years later or 500 years later, no one
Hmm.
actually cares, because it was 500 years ago, and
Yeah.
it's that simple. And
Yeah.
regardless of what your opinion is, there doesn't seem to be any learning on, like, you shouldn't be getting angry about the way a community was treated 500
Yeah.
years ago. And I mean,
Yeah.
it's a slight set digression, but I was doing something the other day on a radio show called A Pointless Fact, and I was talking about how pork pig is the animal and pork is the meat, and uh, cow is the animal and beef is the meat. And that's to do with the fact that when we got invaded by the Normans in 1066, they were French.
Hmm.
And because they all spoke
Yeah.
French, and the Anglo-Saxons all spoke an English that nobody would understand today, to be fair, they
Hmm.
didn't actually cross over with each other, because poor people, the commoners, didn't eat pork and didn't eat beef.
Hmm.
And that's why chicken is still chicken. That's why fish is fish. And there was another, and there's all these weird things because it's actually the class system. So
Hmm.
whenever appears to be that whenever the animal is called different to the meat, it's because rich people ate it and poor people didn't. And
Yeah.
because the French ruled the UK, or what became the UK, and the Anglo-Saxons were taken over. And that's hence the reason we were fighting with the French for so many years, because it was weirdly the French fighting the French, but from England.
Yeah.
And it's just like that's history. That's how it worked.
Yeah. Yeah. It's funny with the internet age because it's to me it's really blown up the Dunning-Kruger effect of people really feel like I'm an expert in this,
Mm,
and despite and they're so insular with their own experiences. All they do is they read about it from one perspective or
yeah,
another, and it becomes, especially when it comes to people versus people interaction, or people interaction. Um, it's we're taught to fear a group of people or hate a group of people. And it's like, well, have you ever met one of them?
yeah,
And if
yeah.
you have, do you feel like that is a accurate depiction of the totality of them? Um, and I kind of have this mindset of the person. I don't have this mindset. I have this image of the kind of person in your hometown who's they have an opinion on everything, but they've lived in the same house they grew up
Yeah.
in, and they worked in the same town. They haven't gone anywhere. And I'm not trying to belittle or demean anyone who hasn't gone out and traveled the world, but I think a healthy spoonful of humility is
Mm,
needed in the area of, I mean, international politics. Like you said, it used to be in the age of paper and radio of, oh, the Germans have invaded Poland. It's like, oh, they
yeah.
have. Oh, well, I guess we hate the Germans.
Yeah.
Which then gives everyone an opinion on it. At the same time, it does. I think that there's everything's a two-sided sword. It has allowed for greater information, especially with the whole citizen journalist movement of everyone is a journalist when they take out their phone, they record something and they
Yeah.
say, the media is telling us one thing, but this video clearly shows that's not true. Um,
That's been a game
And
changer.
that, yeah, that is, I mean, for all the harm that media has done, there's, or technology you could say has done, there is like the double-edged sword. There's a give and take that this really has helped balance things, which I think there's a growing movement now. The one
Mm.
of the stories that I'm always fond of is the story during World War One when the Germans and uh, the Allies got out of their trenches during
Christmas
Christmas and they
Day, yeah.
played a game of a soccer, a football, and it's a idea that like we're all kind of brothers and sisters on this planet.
Yeah.
Like, why are we trying to kill each other? um,
It's also
and
stories like that. Also, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
you're good, you're
Stories like that always leave me with hope because
good.
in the darkest, literally in that case, the darkest trenches, they were like, look, if there's one day that we're not going to do this, it has to be Christmas Day.
Yeah,
And they got out, shared cigarettes, shared food, had a game of football,
yeah,
soccer.
yeah.
Sorry, America. Um,
Yeah. Um,
and do you know
yeah,
what I
and
mean?
that,
And it's just like there's hope in that.
yeah, it's. I think though the the courage to do that, to stand up to
Mm,
your superiors, your officers, and say, "I'm not going to go shoot at that trench." I mean, I imagine the balls on those guys that first stood up out of the trench and said, "I know everyone who's gotten it before had their head blown off. I'm going to get up and I mean, it could have been an officer waving a little flag saying we want to just parlay and
yeah.
talk and say, hey, you want to have a game of footy?
So I mean,
And I mean,
it's
that
just
could happen.
that's a
Even
good point.
then, go
But you
the
can,
superiors to say like, no, that's your enemy. We'll kill them.
yeah,
That comes from a place of getting out of where you're comfortable. Um, and
there's the
if you
courage
want to
to do
move
that, to
forward with
stand up.
kind of
But the courage to stand
yeah,
up from that trench, the first person who did it, and just say, "Look,
yeah,
just literally in this case, hold fire. Let's just take a
yeah,
time out.
yeah,
Christmas Day. Do you want a
yeah.
cigarette? Do you want a piece of cake?" It's just, and I remember reading some stories about it because they used to teach us this in history in England at school when I was at school. I don't think they do it anymore. Could be wrong. But there's some of them exchanged photos of their wives or girlfriends back home to do with me. And there was this weird, like, I suppose making it human. It's like, hey,
Hmm.
with the same
Yeah.
guys, with the same people. But it's interesting you said about the citizen journalism because it made me think about. I think that's probably one of the problems we're having with the media is the very
Hmm.
foundation and structure of the media has always been we will tell you what's happening. And
Hmm.
people turn up with their phones like that's not what happened, and they're like, "No, we're telling you it did." And like, no, there's 20 people here who filmed it themselves, and they don't seem to have adjusted to we have to tell the truth yet.
Yeah. And that's, I think this is one of the scary things uh, about AI is it's becoming so advanced that they can
Yeah,
fabricate things. On the flip side, though, is if the kind of citizen journalist movement keeps up and they say, well, your image is clearly doctored.
yeah,
Um, these 5 phone recordings aren't. Um, that's when there's a battle going on for truth. And that
yeah.
sounds very
No, but it is, isn't it?
grandiose.
It's. I tell you though, because like bringing it back to the books as well, and the whole genre of sci-fi fiction,
Mhm.
fantasy. It's always it always is some group who are just trying to get to the truth and let everyone else know what the truth is. It's
Yeah,
always like, you know what? It's the little guys versus the big guys. It's the
yeah,
working classes versus the rich. It's it's
yeah.
always them versus us versus them. But there's always this
Hmm.
justice for truth at the heart of it all.
Hmm. Or if it's not truth, it's all, there's the idea that even if your life is tough and you
Yeah,
struggle, you want it to be fair. You don't want the system to be rigged against you, which is I think something that a lot of people there's a heavy push now towards the kind of far left movement. There's a romanticization of Marxism. For
oh,
I see
yeah,
it in my high school kids, and I ask them usually, I'm like, "Well, have you read the Communist Manifesto?" And they go, "No." It's like, well, then I mean,
yeah,
you're
yeah.
no
I know.
different than a Bible. hasn't read the Bible. Like
Mm,
you're professing a faith and a belief that you don't know anything about. Um, but there's this movement towards that. I feel like because there is a lot of underhandedness in our society that isn't necessarily indicative of the system being a problem, but certain people have climbed to the top of that system, the kind of crony capitalism, the corporate structure, whatever you want to call it, where companies buy out competitors. I think of
yeah,
Amazon years ago bought out diapers.com. Or they didn't buy them out. I don't want to be sued for libel.
yeah,
they they marked all their diapers on Amazon down so where they're
yeah.
losing money off of
Mm.
them because they want to drive diapers.com out of business. And it's like that. Can we at least have a fair competition? Because I mean, it's you don't want to enter a game of soccer and the ref says, "By the way, you're going to lose. I don't care what you do." It defeats the soul of the player of the game.
Mm.
So, and I think there's a big feeling of that amongst a large swath of the Western population of like,
That's
I feel defeated.
yeah, that's still a big problem in the UK with rich supermarkets where they'll lose money on something so that someone else
Yeah,
can't compete with them. And you just, and like you
yeah,
say, there's just nowhere, and then announce, £1 billion profits, and you're just like, come on, you've just put 100 independents out of business just so you could
yeah,
make a few more dollars, a few more pounds, whatever. And you just like, and like you say, it's
yeah,
that, come on, guys, this isn't fair. And you
yeah,
don't even know one of these 100 independents. It didn't matter to you. It was just a number on an accounting sheet. And you were like, look, we
yeah,
lost 1.5% of sales to
hmm,
how do we get them back? Oh, we'll put 100
yeah,
independents out of business and
yeah,
ruin 100 households across
yeah,
100 towns in the country. It's like, what?
yeah.
So that
It,
you can have a bigger mansion. It's just like you
yeah,
already own 100 acres on a private island. What actually
yeah,
more do you need from life?
yeah. What do you need? What do you need more of? Which it makes me think of God, the oil barons in the U.S. Because there was I keep blanking on his name. I brought this up to a friend the other day as well. The Morgan, J.P. Morgan.
Yeah.
Um, it's, I mean, for all the cronyism that the oil barons did in America, um, there's a couple of them got to a point where they said, "I'm so rich, I I don't know what to do with this," and so they started giving back to the people.
Hmm.
They started making museums. They started, I mean, the Morgan Museum is one of my favorite museums in New York because it's his old house that's now just a massive library. They had a Tolkien exhibit when I was there last, and it's just a gorgeous kind of smaller museum in New York, but it's indicative of that kind of there's a lot of I mean we can sit here and talk about the terribleness of billionaires and we wouldn't be the first to do it. At the same time, there's a number of them who have kind of got to that point. What do I do with this?
Yeah.
What is the point of this? Um,
Because those
it's
original guys that you were talking about, that philanthropy that came,
yeah,
because there's, if you look at a lot of the old cities and towns in Great Britain, there's this philanthropy from hundreds of years ago where they were like, oh, hang on a second,
yeah,
I don't need this. What I do need
yeah,
to do is set up a children's home. And Dr. Barnardo's was a guy that set up a children's home and became a national charity. But there's all these, like you say, museums, parks, you know,
mhm, yeah,
hospitals and everything.
hospital,
Yeah. And the funny thing is back then they didn't do it as a tax write-off. Do you know what I mean? They were just like,
yeah,
no, do you know what? I actually have too much money. I'm going to give
yeah,
it back to somebody and do
yeah,
something good with it. And it would be nice
yeah,
if we got back to a place where that's a thing, where not, oh, how much can I write my taxes off if I do this? It's just like, do you know what? I
yeah,
don't
yeah,
need, I have 1 billion. I don't need the other 100 billion. But
yeah.
maybe, I'll do something with it.
Yeah, yeah, it would be nice. And I think in order for that to happen, there needs to be a bit of a kind of cultural push towards kind of immortalizing the self in the eyes of the people.
Yeah.
Um, as a so I like I said, I teach medieval history, but I also teach Latin, and we get a fair amount of Roman history with that. And the Romans were fantastic with this. Of putting state, I mean, you could be fascist if you want, of saying like what I do is for the glory of Rome. And
Yeah,
so having that kind of cultural push of like, yeah, I've got millions, billions of dollars, whatever it is, but I want people to remember my name because I was it Augustus found the city of rock and he turned it into marble. Right? There's that whole thing. You turn the forum into marble, so people remember him because all the buildings are a lot nicer because of it. Um, if the hospitals got fixed up because a billionaire's got too much money, that sort of cultural push, I think, is where that will happen. Of wanting to kind of immortalize yourself. Um,
yeah. But there's a nice in that, like, do it for the pride, the glory of Rome. That
yeah.
there's and it would have to be monitored if you like, but there's a nice sort of sentimentality to the nationalizing, like I'll be nationally proud of my country, like make
Yeah.
America, do you know what I mean, the land of the free, the land of opportunity and
Yeah.
stuff like that.
Yeah.
The sentiment behind it was one of its sort of driving forces that
Hmm.
made everybody feel like they could have an opportunity just by getting off the boat. If I can get off the boat
Yeah.
and I can do this, I have an opportunity, I have a chance.
Mhm.
And I think it's
Yeah.
that hope versus hopelessness that was
Yeah.
was the difference. Whether it was always
Yeah.
true, well, that's the reality of life is two people see reality differently, and both are true.
Yeah. Um, yeah. It's there. If there's a cultural shift towards hope, that'd be really nice.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Because I mean, especially with, I mean, my students, I see it all the time of just kind of a almost why bother sort of mentality. Again, getting back to somewhat the book of just saying, why do I want anything difficult? I'd rather it be easy. And it's such a toxic mentality
yeah.
that's being cultivated, which um, I mean it's and there's a give and take with this because you have certain things out there you want to have programs in place to help the needy and help the poor. At the same time, there needs to be some struggle in your life for you to kind of push forward. There's the kind of apathy or depression that I see a lot of. One of my really good friends is born and raised in Juarez, Mexico, which is one of the roughest parts of the world. The gang violence there is very extreme. He got out when he was about 11, 12, and he moved here. Um, and him and I have talked about the same sort of topic before of like this hopelessness, depression, and we both kind of settled on the idea that it really is a first world problem
Oh, massively a
because
first world problem.
when you when you're concerned about where you're going to eat, where you're going to sleep, are you going to get shot, are you going to, you know, what's your goal is so focused in your mind of like this is
Yeah,
what I need to survive, and I'm going to go get it, or else I die.
yeah.
I mean that's a terrifying place to be in, but it's at the same time it can also be an extremely invigorating place to be, as odd as that kind of sounds.
No, but it
Um,
is that's the
yeah.
point. That your purpose becomes incredibly simple. It's
Hmm.
what am I going to do for the next 12 hours that gets me to the point that I can get to sleep tonight to wake up about tomorrow. You're not worrying
Yeah.
about whether or not you're going to afford that new car in 6 months from now.
Yeah.
You're not worrying
Yeah.
about whether or not you're going to make vacation next year, and if you don't, what will your friends
Yeah.
think of it, that you couldn't afford to go on holiday?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? You're like,
Yeah.
right, okay,
Yeah.
what am I doing in the next hour that gets me to lunchtime? And you're so in that moment,
Yeah. Hmm.
I wouldn't
Yeah.
want
That,
it,
that
but
that actually happened to me. It happened to me the other day because my wife and I are looking for another car. We have one car, and since I go to work, she works at home, and we're expecting in early April our first child.
congratulations.
And thank you. And so we're shopping around for a second car, so that way she has something to go around with. And I was sitting there just getting frustrated with the different APR rates and which sort of thing to look at, and I'm sitting there and getting frustrated with it. And I'm like, why am I frustrated with buying a new car? Like, what a privileged, entitled position I have. Um, and it's having that bit of self-reflection is really nice. Which, again, which I mean, back to Children of the Dying Hearth. That's why I also classify it as new adult. It's I
Yeah.
do want the reader to have some self-reflection afterwards of saying, like, which of these characters am I? Um,
Mm.
and at some point, you will be all of them, I think. Kel, who's a an elven ranger over 500 years old, right? He's You may think of an elf as very learned and knowledgeable about the world, but because he's young for his race, he only knows his homeland. And so
Yeah.
when he actually ventures out of that, he's very much just like Tessador, the kid he's traveling with, who's 16. And there's a moment where they're on a ship where they actually kind of look at each other, and Tessador's like, "You're how old, and you don't know this?" He's like, "Well, I've never left."
Yeah.
Right? And so that, in a way, kind of speaks to that figure I talked about before of the guy who's never left his hometown, who's worked at the same mill for 50 years and maybe 60 years old, but he knows all about what's going on in the Rhine region with immigration policy, and it's like you don't have a clue.
Yeah.
um,
We
Kell's a
don't.
little bit more self-reflective than those individuals I met, but it's
It's an interesting point, though, isn't it? Because if elves were a real thing, and like
Mhm.
literally they're a young adult at 500 years old,
Yeah,
we when you think about it in reflection, there would be an elf that has
yeah,
spent 1,500 years in his own town and never left.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
like, dude, this is 1,500 years. How did you not once just, well, I was worried
yeah,
about whether I'd get the rent paid. You were around for 1,500 years. What was there to
yeah,
worry about? You know? But there
yeah.
would be the
And that's
one, 500 years. There would
mhm,
be like, oh, do you know what? I'm going to venture out and be
mhm.
clueless because they've never done
Yeah,
anything for. But they take
yeah.
those years for granted, just like we do.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's all relative, which one that was one of my favorite things about writing that character is really kind of tooling around with that idea of, yeah, he's 500, 600 years old, but in relation to his race, I mean,
Yeah,
Lagul, who's the pentarch from the West, he's an elf and he's over 5,000 years old. And so he's very much a elder in the community. 500 though, it's like he's 14,
yeah,
and it's they only can leave the city in the book once they hit 200. At that point, they become rangers and they go out into the West. And it's basically kind of a I stole some of it from different native traditions of kind of a spirit journey of you're
yeah,
going out and you have to survive on your own. Like you've come of age, you are now a man, right? And cultures used to do that at 12, 13, 14 years old. um, I think we could benefit from that today. That's a different conversation. But for him, he's in his teens essentially, and it's a fun idea to mess with. Of yeah, he's 500, 600 years old, but he hasn't got a clue what's going on in the rest of the world. Just as the teenager you run into coming home from school, he may know exactly all the trends on TikTok. He may know exactly who won the Arsenal Chelsea game. He may know exactly who all the players are who were on the bench who didn't get subbed in. But does he have any idea what's going on in West Africa or Southeast Asia or Indonesia?
no,
Like, not a clue.
no, no, not a lot. Um, just going back to something which is what you and I spoke about before we started recording.
Mm.
The explain to me what that word is that I can't pronounce, so that I only learned today. The
So
hey,
there's two pronunciations for it, which is equally then frustrating. So some people will call it the Hagiographical Society or hagiographical with a hard G. I say hagiographical, mainly because I don't have a heavy Greek background. Essentially, so on my resume, that's what you're reading from for
yeah,
those that catch all that. I was a member of the Hagiographical Society, which my academic background, my undergrad background is in pagan and Christian syncretism in the early Middle Ages, late antiquity range. So how paganism influenced Christianity. Um, and then my master's is a little bit more specific, and that's on specifically Saint Duke Canute Lavarth in Denmark, and why the royal necropolis in the 12th century was moved from Roskilde to Ringsted after he was assassinated, and basically concepts of sanctity in the High Middle Ages. The Hagiographical Society is just more or less the historical society associated with the study of saints.
Right.
So anything with the Greek hagios has to do generally with saints when you're dealing in a Christian context. The kind of exception there is the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, right? Actually, sorry, that's not the exception. I mistranslated because Sophia is wisdom, Hagia is just saint. So it's the Greek word for saint, essentially.
Yeah.
Um, so that's all that is. My academic background is in more or less Catholic history. Um, I myself am not Catholic, but I've gone to Catholic school since I was in sixth grade. So all through middle school, high school, undergrad, and then graduate school, I was at some sort of Catholic institution studying the history of the Catholic Church.
It's a
And
fascinating history.
yeah, well, my whole interest in it came from my mother's non-denominational Protestant, um, and I was raised in a non-denominational household for the most part, and so I've always been interested and fascinated with Christianity. The church specifically to me is a study in human institutions and their tendencies. Um,
Yeah.
so it's almost like cultural or historical anthropology that I enjoy. Of like, why do we make these figures out of people that are very flawed?
Yeah.
The two Saint Olaf, sorry, not two of them, it's two King Olafs. But Saint Olaf in Norway is a brutal dude. I mean, he dismembers people, cuts off hands when they disobey him. It's like, why is this guy a saint? Um,
Yeah.
and so studying like how the institution of Catholicism and the church actively changed itself to incorporate different cultures on its periphery so it could expand um, is kind of the core of that interest for me.
It is interesting, isn't it? Because there's lots of myth and legend around Catholic Church. Some of it,
Mm-hmm.
no doubt, is rooted in truth. Some of it is just Dan Brown, and the films that followed. It was, but again, those myths. I think the thing that's hard for people to understand is that if it was possible to trace back myths and legends, you would find the root of the truth. But
Mm-hmm.
again, is that going back to something we said earlier? Is we're looking at it from today's eyes and not from the eyes of somebody 2,000 years ago. So a
Yeah.
story told 2,000 years ago probably doesn't mean how we've interpreted it today.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And all the stories that come up
Mm,
through those 2,000 years associated with it. And that's one of the things too with studying the Catholic Church is all the apocryphal gospels that come up. Those gospels that they shirked and they said we don't want these in our
yeah,
canon. And you read them and you say, "Oh, I understand why," because it clearly makes the point that you don't need a priesthood,
yeah.
um, which the Catholic Church doesn't really want
No,
to have
but I read somewhere,
people
and
be there.
I read somewhere, and I don't know how true this is. So please correct me if I've gone off on a tangent. That agnostic Christians and Christians and Jewish, all of that at one point in time lived alongside each other perfectly fine. And it was only as Christianity was growing and agnostics didn't believe, I think agnostics believed anybody could be, everybody was the child of God sort of thing. And the Roman Christians, if you like, were like, well, there can only be one son of God. And
Yeah,
Constantine was like, yeah, well, I'm the emperor, so that must be me. So this is the road we're going to go down. I
yeah.
might have probably
Constantine's
oversimplified
an
that.
interesting figure. Quick little note just on the terminology there. It would be the Gnostic Christians, which is different than
Gnostic,
the
yeah,
agnostic.
yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
agnostic is the basically not knowing is literally what it means. There could be a God, there could not. The Gnostics were absolutely of the mindset that yeah, we are all basically imbued with the spirit of divinity. That's what a soul is.
Yeah.
So the idea that you need someone to guide you, or to bless you, I should say, you don't need that. A guide, sure. A teacher, absolutely. So within those early Gnostic traditions, which it's unfortunate because most of what we have is written by polemicists, these people that hated the Gnostics and they wrote everything bad about them.
Yeah.
So with that, you have to kind of read it and read in between the lines of like, what do the Gnostics actually believe? And I think the easiest way is actually read the Gnostic Gospels. So uh, and I encourage everyone to do. They're now readily available. These are the Dead Sea Scrolls, essentially.
Oh yeah,
The
yeah,
Gospel of
yeah,
Thomas is
yeah, yeah.
fantastic because it's a heavy point about this of like you don't need this.
Because is that the
And
Gospel of Saint Thomas also?
yeah, yeah. So the Gospel of Thomas is probably my favorite because it makes this point so kind of enigmatically, but clearly at the same time. It's kind of odd, but that's also the nature of Gnosticism.
Yeah,
The concept though of the different groups living in relative peace, you have to remember Jesus was a Jew, so he
yeah,
wasn't setting out to start a new religion at all. He's like, we've become married to the law rather than filled up with the spirit of it, which is what he was then kind of preaching. One of my favorite parables is when I think one of the Pharisees chastises him because it's the Sabbath and he's walking in a field and he just kind of plucks a little piece of grain and the Pharisee says, "Ah, you worked." And it's like you stiff-necked fool. Like, what are you? This isn't working. I'm enjoying the countryside. You've
yeah,
become too married to the letter of it. That yeah, I'm picking grain, but that doesn't mean I'm working on a Sabbath. Um, so Christianity really started as that reform movement, which is also why a lot of Jesus's followers were considered zealots. These are these guys who are like, we need to one overthrow the Romans, but also like we need to kind of fix the issues of our own institution. Um, Once Constantine gets involved, it becomes a little hazier, and it becomes much more aggressive towards each other. Which Constantine's an interesting figure because I'm very firmly of the mindset he was not uh, Christian in any way. He was the Edict of Milan, which he helped pass with his fellow rulers. Basically says pray to the whatever supreme Godhead. That's the wording they use. Um, you want. It makes a note afterwards about if lands were taken, churches were taken from the Christians, they need to be returned because that was wrong. But in terms of saying Christianity is legalized, he's saying every religion is legalized. Pray to whoever you want. It doesn't matter. Um, he was a big proponent of the Mithraic cult, which the army was predominantly of the Mithraic cult. No kind of question why is because Mithras was called the unconquered sun, and so I mean it's the same reason that soldiers today might get a cross tattoo or a Templar tattoo or some sort of thing of like I'm going in, no one can kill me, no one can harm me, I'm unbeatable. You're gonna follow. I mean, before Mithras, it was Mars, right? You pray to that
yeah,
god that like he's gonna protect me, I'm invincible. Um, So, and Constantine was also baptized by one of the Arians, which the whole Council of Nicaea was basically the start of the Catholic Church saying, what do we actually believe? Is Jesus part of God? Is he the Son of God? What is it? And the Arians were saying he's the Son of God, which makes him sort of a demigod. And the Catholics were saying, no, it's the Trinity, the three in one, begotten, not made, all of that. And it was one of the Eusebiuses, and I always mix them up, but it was the Arian one who ended up baptizing Constantine. So in terms of like a good Catholic Christian, there's no real evidence for that. um, but it makes a lot of sense for the Catholics to write the story of like,
yeah,
yes, the emperor sat in on our council and he blessed this. It's like, well, I mean, if he wants, I mean, he may have been there, but that doesn't make him Catholic. It makes him interested in the politics of his empire because he wants to make sure that these groups that are growing exponentially aren't killing each other.
I read that somewhere that actually his main goal was he didn't care. What he wanted was peace, and
Yeah,
whatever way we can get peace, that's what we'll do.
yeah. He was a fantastic politician. The reason we have the Christians have the Sabbath on Sunday is because of him. The reason it's spelled the way it is because the original Latin was dies solis, which is the day of the sun, as in the thing shining in the sky. And the sun was representative of Mithras,
Okay.
that cult that Army was a part of. So he basically made this day of the sun a kind of weekly Roman holiday, which then allowed the growing Christian movement to kind of move that slightly over, just kind of move the goalposts a bit. Like, yeah, Saturday, Sunday, what's the difference?
Yeah.
Um, we all get a holiday then anyway, so might as well take that day off. Which is why the Jews still celebrate the Sabbath on Saturday. They've followed that old tradition and they haven't given that up. And that's the kind of reason why
Yeah.
Christians follow Sunday. It's because it's originally for the God of the sun.
How much of this do you think influences the writing?
All of it.
Oh,
Yeah. So the world of Tesserus, which is the fantasy world for children of the dying hearth, it's influenced by especially that undergrad background in late antiquity. Um,
yeah.
I really want to go for this imagery of a crumbling empire or an empire that has crumbled, and we're kind of living in the skeleton of it. And I really wanted to bring about that feel of, do you know you're in a collapsing civilization? Or do you know you're kind of not in the height of your own civilization?
Mm.
Um, I don't think a lot of people do recognize that as it's happening. There's a lot of things coming out now of people saying, like, do you think the Romans like knew they were uh,
Yeah.
falling, right? And people will reply to this of, feels kind of like now. So I don't think they did. So there's different structures throughout the world that represent the kind of old empire that used to rule all of Tesserus, and that's very much modeled after Rome. Um, but the main city, the Crux, has a lot of architecture that's based off of that late antiquity um, imagery, and it has the feel that the old empire is gone, but we're still living in its remains. So we're kind of the inheritors of it, and we're doing just as well. There's no big difference between us. The idea of the pentarchs, that's very similar to Constantine actually, with the tetrarchy, the rule of four. That when the empire was split up into the four rulers. Um, this is I've changed it around a little bit because in Children of the Dying Hearth, it's much more instead of being displaced at different palaces all throughout Europe, the five rulers are more representatives of their continents and their homelands. So there's four main continents, and then there's a pentarch from the city itself. Um, but that is definitely drawn from that historical background of, what do you do with a very large city? How do you run it? What would be a kind of natural way to do it? Especially since the city itself, it's where the four continents meet. So it would likely be highly contested,
Yeah.
and it was way before the story. Which there's other stories. There's one of the really fun parts about writing is these kind of tangential stories of myth, folklore, all that sort of stuff, coming up with the different cosmology of it. Um, and so the city was contested at one point, and it went back and forth, and eventually the continents kind of agreed, let's share it as kind of this hub, and it grew more and more out of that. Um, and that's all drawn from my own historical background, studying medieval Europe during the Middle Ages, but also late antiquity, that 200 to 800, depending on who you ask. I like to put those ranges because that was one the first range I saw when I started studying late antiquity. Um, but also it covers a little bit more than ranges of other people. But so absolutely, it influences it.
So you said there were six. This is one of six and you're
Hmm.
editing the second now.
Yeah.
Does that mean you already know how number 6 ends?
Yes. um, and this is I sat on this book for about 8 years before I published it, and part of that was just because life got in the way.
Yeah,
Um, I started writing it when I was in Germany, and I was training a couple times a day, um, trained with a team, then I trained by myself, vice versa, and is I have a ton of time. So other than doing Rosetta Stone and learning German, it's let's write a bit, let's get into the fantasy world because I've always enjoyed creating kind of fantasy things, whether it's maps or little stories, whatever. Um, the full story is hashed out in its main points. Um, the nuances of each little character change, character journey, etc. Um, that is not. And the reason I sat on this for a while is one because I wanted to finish it in terms of editing, and get to a point where I'm happy with the content and the story, the character arcs and development and everything. But I also wanted to finish writing the second book. Um,
right.
in a rough draft form because then it allowed me to basically look at the second book and kind of the nuances of what I needed to have there and say, you know what, this would actually be really good to include back here. And then I can add a couple lines in rather than going, oh crap, would have been really nice if I mentioned that in the first book because now this is just going to feel like a Deus Ex and well, where'd these guys come from?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
uh, which I don't want that to happen at all. Which is so the second book is for the most part, content wise, finished. I don't think I'll be adding anything significant to it. I'm having a couple people look it over for editing. Um, there's already one thing that I need to fix with it it's kind of on the to do list. But that I won't. I would like to have it be out by the end of this year. Um, and part of the reason for that is because I'm halfway through the draft for the third book. And so
Right,
having
so you're
that kind of
really, really quite far ahead.
Yeah, and so it in a way is kind of designed as two trilogies. Um, the full thing is called the Annals of Tessian, and you kind of find that out why in the second book. Um, but the the core elements of those first three are pretty much hashed out. The next three, or I should say, the nuance points of the first three are more or less hashed out. The next three, it's just the big bullet points of the character needs to go from here to here to here in terms of their development. This is the main uh, kind of emotional or physical journey that they need to go through. And this is where it ends. This is kind of the point of the whole book. This is the point of the second series. That's all more or less hashed out. But it's those fine nuance points that I haven't got to that because I haven't written it yet.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, that's good. That's good. So I'm going to finish up with a really random question, which is a question I just like to ask people, and it will fit you well because it requires a lot of imagination. So
Ooh.
imagine a fantasy world where you can time travel, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can go anywhere in history that you want to go. Where are you going to go? What car would you drive? And what would you be listening to on the radio?
Mm. The last part is the most difficult, I think, because I have such an eclectic music taste.
Do you know that's why
My
one of the
wife and
reasons
I
I
just,
include that because I have such an eclectic taste in music. I like to
um,
know what other people are listening to.
yeah. So my wife and I are somewhat old souls. And so for her birthday, actually, I got her a record player, and so we've been getting some
Nice.
records here and there. And I always thought, I don't know what the difference is with the sound, and then actually listening to the record, I'm like, yeah, there is something different about the sound. It does sound a little better.
Mm.
Um, and the last two records we got. was Vivaldi, The Four Seasons,
Yeah,
and My Chemical Romance, Welcome to the Black Parade.
that's a
So
contrast.
very, very different, very contrasting. I think as a kind of child of the 90s and early 2000s, there's a soft spot in my heart for
Yeah,
that kind of punkish, emo-ish
yeah.
uh, bit, like Blink 182 and all that. So I'd have a really hard time with the music. With where to go, I would choose one of three locations. I know that's not really the thing you were looking for.
You can have as
Uh,
many options as you want. It's the conversation
um,
I like.
yeah. Uh, One, I would really like to. Um, there's a swath in the Middle Ages that would be fun to see, be fun
Mm.
to visit. That I would say 1300. Um, and I'm not so picky with place. England, France, or Italy would likely
Yeah,
be the areas. Bohemia would also be really neat. Um, but that 1300 area would be really neat because it's the kind of height of the high Middle Ages and the plague hasn't hit yet.
yeah,
So I'm just safe enough that I can see all the wonders of the textile factories. I can maybe avoid the fullers and their washing of cloth with cow urine, but maybe go see some kind of the phasing out of knights and some sort of like really live the Renaissance fair
yeah, yeah,
mentality.
yeah,
Uh, there's that. There's also I think uh, the height of the Roman Empire would be
mm.
a really fun place to see. It wouldn't be very safe necessarily, but just from a historical background, going to um, that early second century, mid second century, maybe Rome, really see the Colosseum at its height. Um,
yeah, yeah,
I've been to Rome a couple times and I love it every time I go. Um, but seeing it in its element, I think would be such a fun thing. If I did that, I'd probably be driving a Fiat,
yeah.
just so I could go through the streets. um, for the other one, the first one, not really sure what I'd be driving. Uh,
That's right.
but the last location is a bit of an oddball, um, and that would be before the Younger Dryas period, about 12,000 years ago.
Yeah,
If I could go 15,000 years back and see what civilization looked like, because there's more and more things coming out now
yeah,
of humanity's existence before the last major ice age of the Younger Dryas period. Um, there's, is it, I won't say it's Serbia, but if it's not, Bosnia will get upset with me. Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
it's one of the Eastern European countries. Um, there's a pyramid that was found through basically LiDAR scanning that it's one of the largest, it might be the largest pyramid in the world that I think they dated at 37,000 years old.
Shit.
And it's going back then like 20,000 years, like what did we actually look like?
Mm.
And with the global catastrophe that happened that kind of right around the Younger Dryas period, when you have these mass extinction events, something happened that wiped out a lot of humanity and civilization. And um, I think one of the fun conversations with that is like, well, why don't we have um, like what? Why didn't we have more survivors from that? It's like, well, the people that survived were the hunter gatherers, the ones who knew how to survive on their own. So those are the people that then built up civilization again.
Yeah,
Um, but if I was at that period, I would like something a little more rugged. Um, Probably go for some diesel truck or something
yeah.
that could really handle the
Mm.
terrain.
One of
Um,
those can go off grid for a month.
Yeah. Which I think if I was driving that at that time, just for sheer shock value, maybe some AC/DC
Yeah,
in the in the CD player, just
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Highway to Hell, as I
Thunderstruck or something.
some yeah. um, yeah, those will be the three times. Three cars would then be that some diesel truck, I'm sure, a little Fiat, and I had no idea for the 1300s one.
You can just be a horse.
Yeah, yeah, it could just be a horse. I want to kind of blend in, I think, with that one. So
Yeah, yeah.
maybe a horse. Having a little Walkman there with some Gregorian chant to fit in wouldn't be bad, but be getting enough of that anyways. So um, I think there's again that kind of fantasy. If you show up at a Renaissance fair in a Lamborghini and blaring some death metal or something. Um,
Perfect.
I think that's a fun image to think about, but at the same time, I'd probably find myself on the tied to a pole with a bunch of wood underneath me pretty quick,
Oh
and
yeah,
a
definitely.
fire drum.
Yeah, you'd be there for a burning.
So yeah, that part would be fun. I have to keep my head down.
This has been brilliant. Thank you so much, so much. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I've enjoyed it too. I'm happy to come back anytime,
Oh,
and
definitely.
yeah, and once again, yeah, Children of the Dying Hearth. It's up on all major online retailers for ebook. I believe just Amazon has it for the hard copy, which is this
Yep.
here. Um, you can also find that or any information about me, both academic and fiction related, on my website, martinraynelson.com. Um, I have one of my short stories is up there as well. I want to be adding some more of that. But I won an award for one of my science fiction short stories, and that's up there for free. But you can find the book on there, and hope to be back on your podcast again.
Oh,
It's been
definitely.
fun.
We can definitely do this. We can definitely do this again. I've
Yeah.
really, really appreciated it. Thank you.
All right. Well, let me know.
And there you have it. There is Martin. And as well as talking about many things, we were talking about his new book, one of six, Children of the Dying Hearth. And please do check him out. Do check out the book. And I will make sure, as always, the links are in the description. And as always, thank you for listening. Wherever you are from, whatever you believe, please do take care.